7-7X prototype is another example of the prototype series, with all its resources paid in power, with 1 turn preparation time and even 100 attack and 100 health. It's considered to be army force, sub-type tank, meaning it's a land force. It has 3 abilities. Cloak can't be blocked if it has combat. Combat enemies can specify this, and stealth can't be blocked by forces without stealth. Now let's look at this card in more depth. The biggest problem with 77X prototype is that it costs 5 power. If we take a look at power territories, we soon see that they all have one pretty interesting thing in common. Mainly, they all have under 400 health on single production ones, and the ones that really produce a lot of power have only about 280 or under 300 health, with hefty more costs like 8 in the spawns resource in this case, and 8 as well on this almost identical fusion powers in this card. This means that if you want to play more than one prototype, you are probably going to have to run heavy power territories and risk losing early, or use some 8 units like Agborg Electric Engineer, who is a soldier force that produces 1 power each turn, meaning you have to prepare your force in a certain way, and as well as your territory, so that you can actually utilize the card. However, there is one good point about the 77 action, and that is it's a rank force card, meaning it has a G-Force variant. G-Forces are cards that you can only have 1 copy of in your entire deck, and this isn't by type, so this means your entire deck can have entirely only 1 G-Force. It doesn't have to be this type of card, it could be something else, but if you have something other as a G-Force, you are unable to have this one to your deck. The main benefit of G-Forces is that they only cost generic cards, and having 5 generic resources as a resource cost is way more manageable than having 5 power, as you can replace generic resources with any other specific resource, while replacing power with something else would cost you 2 resources for each power, even at worst case resulting to 10 resources spent if you have no power production abilities. There is an additional way to make this card cheaper, and it's the used card called Colossal Warehouse, which is pretty expensive to use as it costs one of these resource types, but it has a unique ability that converts all your unspent resources, which means all the resources that are not attached to cards as a cost for playing them, and they become anytime. This basically means that every single turn you produce resources or have any resources left, they automatically will be attached to this card. You have no choice of negating it once you play. And they are considered any type, which means that you can use them with 1:1 ratio to pay costs of any resource you have in cards. This means that the hefty 5 power cost 77X prototype would be as simple as just matching the resources one by one. The next that we want to look is the attack damage and health value of this card. Having 100 damage and health means it can block and destroy almost all land forces in a blocking situation, outside of course other rank 4 cards besides this one, and some of the heftier ones like the T99 Leon Heavy Tank. It's also worth mentioning that besides the 77X prototype and T99 Lion Heavy Tank, non-rank 4 land forces cannot have over 100 health even if they are fight force. Of course, the rank 4 ones are exceptions since they usually start with a rather high health value. This generally means that in almost every single blocking scenario, this card will be able to destroy their counterpart. Covert mechanic, especially this combination of cloak and covert, means that this card can be blocked and enemies cannot specify this card. Specifying means that this card cannot be targeted by abilities. So all the usual suspects, including Mark Rockwell, who is notorious for being able to take out any units without armor by just entering the play, are unable to target that card. This essentially makes this card untouchable in control situation as long as it has command. Covert, however, is tied to intel superiority, so if your opponent has more intel than you do and they play a card called Amplified Uplink Facility, they are able to remove the covert effect, meaning that the 77X no longer has scammers and it can't be blocked by any forces that could block it normally. This also means that you can just have one intel less than your opponent, and this ability would still come into play as it requires only most intel. However, the 77X prototype also has the stealth mechanics, which means it can't be blocked by stealth forces. Though the amplified uplink facility would remove this as well, so if you see that card on the field, it means your 77X prototype is blockable, since the cloak only protects this card from being blocked if it the combat effects on the play. So any card that is able to block land units would be able to block this card in that situation. One thing, however, that can be removed from this card is its attack value. All the control cards in this game, such as Brainwash or Destructive Hijacking, are unable to target cards that have 100 or more damage. This means this card is almost entirely immune to all the traditional control mechanics. However, it still can be picked up with cards like Mark Rockwell or Goliath, which have the pick-up mechanic that eliminates a card on the field they could block, as long as this card doesn't have covered mechanic. And as for set 1, there are no cards in set 1 that reduce the damage value of a card by any number, meaning this card is more or less uncontrollable with those abilities. As for combination with this card, the earlier mentioned 77X and Colossal Warehouse combination is a pretty good one if you want to play multiple copies of this prototype card. Having multiple copies would mean that you have hard to defend against land force that steadily does 100 damage to your opponent, which is pretty significant on a longer game. It's a quite expensive approach, but it can be quite effective as long as you manage to maintain intel rate. If you want to do something like that, you might want to use cards that let you find this one, like the Intercards Dispatch Agent, which also requires you to have soldier forces to activate, but if you have soldiers to sacrifice, this is one of the better search cards in this entire game. Then of course you can use draw aids like the Field Research or Rummage to get some extra draws, so you can draw more of those to your hand. Or just use Search Algorithm to get it on top of your deck, and if you combine this with the Field Research I showed you earlier, or Rummage card, this also means that you can get the card to your hand on the same turn you play. Rummage specifically would probably be a good card to use, since Rummage also costs power. So if you put the power heavy deck and like to run the 77X, you usually have the power cost to pay for the Rummage cost. There's also of course the optimized outcome, which lets you put any card in your hand, but it's a bit more expensive choice than, let's say, the Dispatch Agent. One card I'd like to point out as well, if you absolutely want to get 77X on the hand or any army force in general, is the B-25 Zeus Transport, which is extremely expensive card to use at pure cost. So it's not probably plausible to use this with the 77X power costs unless you go for the G-Force. As this one has a unique mechanic related to deploy for set 1, it lets you find army forces instead of soldier forces, which means you can find tanks, and 77X being an army force means that you can also find it from your arsenal. As for countering 77X, and there are a few units that are able to counter this one, especially as long as the cloak and combat mechanics are. So what you need is to either have the amplified upclean facility to just prevent this card from having those mechanics and have inter superiority, or use means that do not target opponent's units. One of those means is the notoriously difficult to use, but quite cheap EMD card called Orbital Sun Cannon, which has an interesting aspect to it. It only costs 3 power, but it's 4-time preparation, and it does 100 health damage this turn to each force in specific enemy legion. And as you noticed, the 77X has exactly 100, so just having this card on the field and possibly hastening it up with cut corners would mean that you are able to take it out just fine. Another nifty way to take out 77X is to use one of the wipeout VMDs like Sub-Launch Attack, which eliminates all soldier forces and army forces as specific enemy controls. There is no really effective way to prevent this outside delaying this ability or taking out all the sufferings in opponent's field before it fires. So it's a rather effective 77X counter. There's also the Fight Prosperous Bomb, which I could say is the 77 Axis sibling card's favorite combination EMD. I'm talking about the 101 Hex prototype. This one also, when attached to a bomber, will eliminate all enemy soldier and army forces if it manages to damage enemy territory. So this also will take out 77 Axe without any problems. Best cheaper way to counter it, however, is to use mother cards, which do not cost any resources to play. If you're using Navy forces, you might want to use Tsunami card, which prevents soldier and army forces from attacking or blocking, meaning that the 77 Axe is unable to do any damage on their opponent's turn unless they remove this mother. Additionally, if you want to stall, the Breathing Rainstorm and Lasting Blizzard are good options since they both have a mechanic that prevents all forces from attacking or blocking. Do however keep in mind that should you use these cards, you are also unable to block unless you counter that effect by some means like, let's say, using Push Through card that allows you to attack through weather effects. Let's sum it up. 77 Axe prototype is extremely expensive unless you supplement it with cards like Colossal Warehouse. To play a tank that is practically unstoppable on the field. It lasts almost all blocking situations against still on rank 4 forces. It having Cloak and Cover means it cannot be taken out even with the heavier methods like Kinetic Space Strike, which eliminates any card. It can be countered, however, by multiple means. One being using the Orbital Sun Cannon to just take it out, or just use weathers to stall it. You also can prevent the activation of this card, since this card has a 1 preparation time and 5 power resource cost. It's easy to spot on the field. So just use cards like Calculate the Stagnation to increase the timer on that card and make opponent's life rather complicated to choose them. Now the big question, should you Fireforge this card? Fireforging rank 4 cards can be rather expensive. So if you want to just cut your costs and not spend a lot of money on this card, and generally aren't lucky at throwing them, Fireforging might not be a thing you want to do. However, if you intend to use the 77 Axe prototype, especially its G-Force variant, as your core force, I would actually recommend Fireforging it, despite there being no real challenges for this on the under rank 4 tier forces. And the main reason for that is the earlier mentioned Orbital Sun Cannon. As you see, the 77X prototype has 110 health with Fireforge. If you take a look at the Orbital Sun Cannon, we can see it reduces health by 100, meaning the just tiny increase of 10 health to 77X with Fireforging would prevent this card from eliminating it. However, do remember that the opponent can play multiple copies of this card and time them so they hit at the same turn, meaning it's possible your efforts will go in vain, but it's one way to negate a single hit of this card as a countermeasure. 77 Axe is a rather steady damage dealer that is very hard to counter, but is also extremely expensive card. So I would recommend you to use this outside of G-Force variant, unless you really know what you're doing and you are building your deck well with search mechanic to find it, as well as sustainable means of producing power without taking extra risks. Besides that, it's a nifty prototype card to have, and I'd recommend at least getting the G-Force variant for your collection.